The birthday cake sat untouched on the mahogany table, 10 candles flickering like tiny beacons in the growing darkness of Admiral Carson's study. Matthew pressed his small body deeper into the shadows behind the grand piano, watching the men in black tactical gear pour through the French doors like oil spilling across marble. He couldn't hear their footsteps, couldn't hear his father's shouts from upstairs, couldn't hear the shattering glass that sent glittering fragments across the Persian rug. But he could feel the vibrations through the floor, each thunderous impact traveling up through his fingertips pressed against the wood, translating violence into a language only he understood. The lead intruder moved with mechanical precision, hand signals directing his team through rooms Matthew had played in since before he lost his hearing at age 4. Outside, the coastal wind whipped against the windows, and Matthew knew the storm his father had mentioned at breakfast had finally arrived. His mother's photograph smiled down from the mantel, frozen in time before the car accident that took her 3 years ago, before his world became permanently silent. Matthew counted 7 intruders, their shadows dancing across walls decorated with his father's naval commendations and classified security clearances. One man stationed himself at the bottom of the grand staircase, while others rifled through his father's desk, yanking drawers free and scattering papers like autumn leaves. The vibrations changed suddenly, becoming sharper, more urgent, and Matthew recognized the pattern of running feet descending the stairs. His father appeared in the doorway, hands raised, still wearing the silly party hat from dinner, its bright colors absurd against the masked faces surrounding him. Through the crack between piano and wall, Matthew watched his father's lips form words he couldn't hear, saw fear transform the face that had always meant safety. Then a new figure entered, and even from his hiding place, Matthew felt the shift in the room's energy. This man moved differently, carried authority that made the others step back instinctively. He removed his mask, revealing sharp features and a scar that curved from temple to jaw, like a crescent moon. The man pressed a gun against his father's chest, lips moving in what Matthew's experience told him were questions, demands, threats. His father shook his head, violently, and the man struck him across the face with casual brutality. Matthew's hand found the toy soldier in his pocket, the one his father had given him that morning with a promise that heroes always protect the innocent. The groundskeeper's hand appeared first, calloused fingers spreading against the piano's polished wood inches. From Matthew's face, Marcus Webb lowered himself to the floor with the fluid silence of a predator, his weathered features coming into Matthew's line of sight. The man had been working on the estate for only 3 weeks. Yet something in his storm-grey eyes conveyed immediate understanding. Without speaking, Marcus pressed his palm flat against the floor, then tapped 3 times, slow and deliberate, his gaze locked on Matthew's face with an intensity that demanded attention. Matthew felt each tap through the hardwood, recognized the pattern as intentional communication rather than random noise. Marcus pointed to his own eyes, then to the room beyond their hiding place, then back to Matthew, miming the act of watching. His hands moved in gestures Matthew instinctively understood, a visual language born of necessity rather than formal training. The groundskeeper produced a small notepad from his work vest, sketching rapid figures with positions marked throughout the estate's floor plan. He pressed the pencil into Matthew's hand, tapping the drawing, then pointing to the boy's eyes again. The message crystallized with perfect clarity. You can see what I cannot, and together we become something neither of us could be alone. Matthew's heart hammered against his ribs as Marcus placed both hands on the floor, demonstrating how vibrations could map movement, how pressure translated into information. Through the piano's legs, Matthew watched his father being forced into a chair, watched the scarred man circling like a shark scenting blood. Marcus followed his gaze, and something dangerous flickered across the groundskeeper's expression, something that transformed him from humble estate worker into something else. Entirely, he touched Matthew's shoulder, a pressure that meant weight. then pointed to himself and made a walking motion with his fingers. Before Matthew could react, Marcus reached inside his shirt and withdrew a worn leather pouch hanging from a cord around his neck, clutching it briefly with an expression of such profound pain that Matthew felt it like a physical blow. Marcus tucked the pouch back against his chest, then placed his hand over Matthew's heart, then his own, creating a bond that transcended words. The silent promise passed between them carried the weight of sacred oaths. We protect each other, we trust the darkness, we turn your silence into our greatest weapon. Marcus moved through the estate's shadows with the precision of smoke, Matthew following 3 paces behind, mimicking the groundskeeper's careful footfalls. Every few moments, Marcus would stop, his hand dropping to that leather pouch beneath his shirt, fingers wrapping around it with a grip that suggested drowning men clutching driftwood. Matthew noticed how the man's breathing changed when he touched it, becoming shallow and irregular, as though the simple act of contact reopened old wounds. Through the corridor's dim light, Matthew watched Marcus pause at a window, surveying the grounds while his free hand remained pressed against his chest, protecting whatever the pouch contained with an intensity that bordered on obsession. When footsteps approached from the adjacent hallway, Marcus didn't reach for a weapon or push Matthew toward safety. Instead, he clutched that pouch tighter, his body positioning itself between the potential threat and the object around his neck. The moment crystallized Matthew's understanding. Whatever resided in that worn leather mattered more to Marcus than his own survival, more than tactical advantage, more than rational thought. They retreated behind a towering bookcase as 2 intruders passed, and Matthew felt Marcus trembling beside him, one hand still clenched around the pouch. When the danger cleared, Marcus finally released his grip, leaving the leather creased with the impression of his fingers. He caught Matthew watching, and something vulnerable flickered across his hardened features, a crack in the armor revealing depths of grief the boy recognized from his own reflection. Marcus slowly withdrew the pouch, holding it in both palms like a holy relic, his storm-gray eyes glistening in the half-light. He opened the drawstring with reverent care, tilting it so Matthew could glimpse the contents, a small electronic device, intricate and delicate, surrounded by protective foam. The way Marcus gazed at that device carried the weight of prayers unanswered and promises broken, of time running backward to moments that could never be reclaimed. Marcus closed the pouch and pressed it against his heart, then reached out and placed his other hand against Matthew's ear, the gesture speaking volumes. Whatever that device represented, it connected to Matthew's world of silence, to the spaces between sound where meaning lived without words. The groundskeeper's eyes held a question and a warning simultaneously. This matters more than you can imagine, and before this night ends, you'll understand why. Matthew nodded, accepting the mystery, understanding that some truths require darkness before they can emerge into light. The grand staircase erupted with the thunder of boots descending, and Marcus pulled Matthew deeper into the alcove's shadows as Admiral Carson was dragged into the marble foyer, his dress uniform torn at the shoulder, blood trickling from a split lip. 3 armed men flanked him, while a 4th figure emerged from the darkness, with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to command, his tactical gear immaculate despite the violence of the invasion. Marcus's entire body went rigid, his breath catching in his throat as recognition slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The man directing the operation moved with a gait Marcus had memorized through countless missions, a slight favor of the left leg from an old parachute injury, and when he turned toward the light, Marcus's world collapsed into a single impossible word that died silently on his lips: Riker. Commander Jackson Riker stood 6 feet from the Admiral, removing his balaclava with deliberate slowness to reveal features Marcus had mourned for 5 years. Features he'd last seen disappearing beneath rubble in Kandahar when the safe house exploded. The same sharp jawline, the same surgical scar above his right eyebrow, but the eyes had transformed from brother-in-arms warmth to something glacial and calculating. Marcus watched his ghost speak, demanding access to the submarine defense codes with an authority that suggested this wasn't negotiation, but predetermined outcome. "Admiral," Carson spat blood onto the marble, defiant despite his restraints, and Riker responded by pressing a pistol against the Admiral's temple, with the casual intimacy of someone who'd held weapons against temples before, who'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Matthew gripped Marcus's arm, feeling the groundskeeper's muscles coiled like spring. Steel, sensing the violence barely contained beneath the surface. Marcus's hand moved instinctively toward where a weapon should have been, then diverted back to the leather pouch, clutching it as though choosing between two impossible futures. The man he'd called brother, the man he'd eulogized, the man whose wife he'd consoled and whose children he'd helped through grief, stood breathing and commanding and utterly transformed into something unrecognizable. Riker's voice carried across the foyer, cold and precise, explaining that the Admiral had exactly 10 minutes to provide access codes before they started removing fingers, and Marcus realized with devastating clarity that the invasion wasn't random but surgical, personal, orchestrated by someone who understood naval protocols because he'd once sworn to protect them. The weight of betrayal doubled, then tripled, as Marcus processed the implications. Riker hadn't just survived. He'd chosen darkness, and now Marcus faced the impossible mathematics of loyalty divided against itself. His former brother threatening the Admiral's son pressed against his side, and between them all that device around his neck representing the daughter he'd failed, the redemption he'd been desperately seeking. Matthew looked up at Marcus and saw tears streaming down the groundskeeper's face, silent and unstoppable grief and rage and recognition warring across features that suddenly looked decades older. Marcus's hands trembled as he pulled Matthew deeper into the alcove, the leather pouch burning against his chest like a brand of failure and desperate hope intertwined. The boy's questioning eyes demanded explanation for the tears, for the trembling, for the way Marcus clutched that worn leather as though it contained his very soul. In the foyer beyond, Riker's countdown continued, but Marcus barely heard it, lost in the memory of another child's face, another pair of eyes that had looked to him for salvation he couldn't provide. He opened the pouch with shaking fingers, revealing not documents or weapons, but something infinitely more precious, a device no larger than a pearl, suspended in protective gel, its surface etched with circuitry so delicate it resembled lace made of light. Her name was Emma, Marcus whispered, his voice fracturing around the syllables as Matthew read his lips in the darkness. She was 7 when the fever took her hearing, and I was 6,000 miles away, dismantling weapons caches, while she learned to navigate a silent world without me. The device caught ambient light, glowing softly between them, as Marcus explained how he'd spent every leave, every spare moment, every dollar he earned, working with engineers and audiologists to create what medicine couldn't provide. Emma had been scheduled for the implantation the week he returned from deployment, but fate had proven crueler than any enemy combatant when a distracted driver ran a red light 3 blocks from their home, stealing futures and possibilities in a single devastating moment. Matthew touched the pouch with reverence, understanding without words the weight of love transformed into obsession, grief channeled into purpose. Marcus had carried this prototype for 2 years, like a talisman against the guilt that consumed him. The father who'd chosen duty over presence, who'd believed there would always be time for redemption tomorrow. The device represented thousands of hours in laboratories, depleting his savings, learning disciplines foreign to a soldier's training, all to build something that could no longer save the child it was designed for. But looking at Matthew now, watching this boy navigate terror with courage, born from his own silent strength, Marcus saw possibility flickering back to life like a candle, refusing to surrender to darkness. "It was never tested on a living person," Marcus said, his honesty brutal and necessary as Riker's voice grew louder, more insistent beyond their hiding place. "But Emma would have wanted someone to hear the world she never could. And maybe this is why I survived when everyone I've loved hasn't." Matthew's hand closed over the pouch, over Marcus's trembling fingers, and in that gesture passed an understanding that transcended speech. Sometimes salvation comes not through saving those we've lost, but through refusing to lose anyone else. The makeshift surgical theater they created in the wine cellar existed in a pocket of suspended reality, where desperation transformed groundskeeper and child into collaborators in an act that defied every instinct of preservation. Marcus laid out the tools he'd assembled, his field medical training never intended for something so delicate, so potentially catastrophic. Matthew sat perfectly still on the wooden crate, his jaw set with determination that belonged to someone decades older, watching Marcus sterilize instruments with vodka from the Admiral's collection, while shadows from a single candle painted their faces in flickering amber. Above them, footsteps thundered across hardwood floors as Riker's men searched room by room, their invasion providing both urgency and cover for what they were about to attempt. The device rested between them like a promise made of circuitry and impossible hope, its surface catching light as Marcus explained through gestures and written words exactly what could go wrong. Infection, permanent nerve damage, complete loss of any residual hearing Matthew possessed, or worse, catastrophic failure that would leave him trapped between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Matthew's response came not in words, but in action, tilting his head to expose the vulnerable curve behind his ear, where Marcus would have to cut, trusting with the absolute faith of childhood that sometimes adults deserve the belief we place in them. Marcus pressed his forehead against Matthew's for one suspended heartbeat, sharing breath and fear and determination, before picking up the scalpel with hands that had dispatched enemies across 3 continents, but had never held another soul's future quite so literally. The first incision was a prayer made manifest in flesh, precise and terrible in its intimacy. Blood, welling dark against pale skin as Marcus worked with concentration that blurred everything except the microscopic landscape of tissue and bone. Matthew never flinched, never pulled away, his silence now transformed from disability into supernatural strength, each shallow breath synchronized with Marcus's movements as though they'd become a single organism dedicated to this singular, impossible purpose. The insertion required 17 agonizing minutes that stretched into lifetimes, Marcus's fingers performing a ballet of precision through layers of dermis and cartilage, while sweat carved rivers down his temples, despite the cellar's cool darkness. The device slipped into place with resistance that made Marcus's heart seize before something clicked, subtle as a whisper but final as a door closing, the prototype settling against Matthew's cochlear structure in an embrace that would either grant miracles or confirm Marcus's deepest fear that he was cursed to fail every child who trusted him. He sutured the wound with thread, meant for upholstery, his fingers moving through muscle memory while his mind calculated infection risks and healing timelines, knowing they had minutes at best before Riker's search brought violence to their hiding place. When Marcus activated the device through the external magnetic controller, Matthew's entire body went rigid, his eyes widening, with something between terror and wonder as his brain suddenly received signals it had been denied since birth, the world flooding in through channels that had remained silent for a decade of existence. The world crashed into Matthew's consciousness like an ocean through shattered glass, sound flooding neural pathways that had remained dormant. Deserts for his entire existence, transforming silence into a roaring symphony of previously invisible phenomena. His fingers clawed at the wooden crate beneath him as his brain struggled to process the overwhelming cascade of information. The rhythmic drip of water against stone somewhere in the cellar's darkness, the creak of floorboards. Overhead, translating weight into auditory signatures, Marcus's ragged breathing, transforming from visual chest movements into this raw, intimate presence that seemed to vibrate inside Matthew's skull. The candle flame wasn't just light anymore, but possessed sound, a subtle whisper of combustion that Matthew had never imagined existed, while his own heartbeat became a thunderous drum that seemed to shake his entire perception of reality. Marcus gripped his shoulders, mouthing words that suddenly carried weight beyond lip-reading, and when sound finally connected to meaning, Matthew heard for the first time in his life, "Stay with me, son, breathe through it, let your brain adjust." But Matthew wasn't listening to Marcus anymore, because filtering through the chaos of newfound sensation came a voice from directly above them, muffled by flooring but unmistakable in its authority and timbre, speaking words that reconfigured Matthew's entire understanding of the invasion unfolding through his home. "The codes are in the study safe. Combination is my son's birthday. Take what you need and disappear before Webb complicates this further," Admiral Carson said, with the exhausted resignation of someone who'd already surrendered pieces of his soul in increments too small to notice until nothing remained. Matthew's face drained of color as comprehension crashed through him, the miraculous gift of hearing delivering its first devastating truth. His father wasn't a hostage, but a collaborator, wasn't a victim, but the architect of treason wrapped in paternal desperation. Marcus saw the recognition bloom across the boy's features, watched innocence shatter in real time as Matthew understood that the parent he'd been fighting to save had already betrayed everything the uniform represented, sold secrets that would cost lives to fund experimental treatments that might restore the hearing his son had just gained through entirely different means. The betrayal existed in layers Matthew's mind scrambled to process, while sounds continued their assault on his overwhelmed senses. His father's footsteps moving toward the study carried weight that now seemed heavy with guilt. Riker's responding laughter held edges of triumph that cut through walls and flesh alike, and beneath it all, Marcus's breathing changed rhythm in ways that suggested the groundskeeper had suspected this truth long before the device made it audible. Matthew turned to face the man who'd just given him the world, only to have that gift immediately poison everything he thought he understood. Tears streaming silent down his cheeks, while his newly activated hearing picked up their impact against his shirt collar, each drop a tiny detonation of shattered faith. Marcus pulled the boy against his chest, sheltering him from sounds he couldn't yet filter, while whispering truths that hurt worse than any scalpel. Sometimes the people we love most make choices that break us, and we have to decide whether love means protecting them from consequences or protecting the world from what that love made them become. The wine cellar had become a confessional where Matthew heard not just his father's treason, but the impossible weight of choice settling onto shoulders that had carried nothing heavier than birthday wishes just hours before. The device in his skull, now a burden of knowledge that couldn't be unheard or forgotten. Marcus emerged from the wine cellar with Matthew's hand locked in his own, ascending the servants' staircase toward the study, where two men who'd shaped his life in vastly different ways waited like opposing forces in a collision that would leave only wreckage. The house had transformed from an elegant coastal estate into a psychological battlefield, where loyalty faced betrayal, where brotherhood confronted disillusionment, and where a child's newfound hearing would bear witness to truths that most adults spent lifetimes avoiding. Matthew's fingers tightened around Marcus's palm as they approached the study door, the device in his skull now translating every sound into weighted meaning, his father's heavy breathing on the other side of the threshold, Riker's boots pacing patterns that Marcus recognized from a dozen missions they'd survived together, the tick of the grandfather clock marking seconds that felt like judgments. Marcus felt the boy trembling, but also felt something else, a steel core forming in someone too young to carry such burden, yet unable to set it down, and he recognized that terrible strength because he'd forged it himself in the crucible of impossible choices that turned soldiers into ghosts, haunting their own lives. The study door swung open without warning, Riker's weapon tracking their entrance before recognition softened his combat stance into something more complex, an expression mixing relief and regret that belonged to the brother Marcus remembered before warfare rewrote both their definitions of survival. Admiral Carson stood by the window overlooking the ocean, his dress uniform still pristine despite the moral compromise that had stained everything it represented. And when he turned to face his son, Matthew saw a parent aged decades by desperation that had metastasized into treason. "You shouldn't have involved the boy," Riker said, and Marcus heard beneath the accusation an old wound still bleeding, the tone of someone who'd watched his own family slip away while following orders that promised purpose but delivered only emptiness. Carson moved toward Matthew, but Marcus stepped between them, creating a human barrier as he addressed both men with the quiet authority of someone who'd already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. "He's not involved. He's the only one here who sees clearly, because he spent 10 years watching instead of speaking, and now he can hear every lie you've both constructed to justify what you've become." Matthew stepped around Marcus before anyone could stop him, positioning himself in the geometric center of the room, where all three men could see him clearly. His hands moving through sign language his father understood, while his voice, unused and uncertain, shaped words the device now let him hear himself forming. "Dad, I know why. You did this. I know you sold those secrets to buy me sound. But I never asked you to trade lives for my ears, never wanted my silence to cost that much." Carson's face crumbled as his son's voice reached him for the first time. The miracle he'd committed treason to achieve now weaponized against the choices that had made it possible, and he sank into the leather chair behind his desk, as though his spine could no longer support the weight of paternal love corrupted into catastrophic judgment. Riker lowered his weapon completely, something in Matthew's raw honesty cutting through years of calculated survival, and Marcus saw his former brother's eyes glisten with recognition of innocence. Neither of them had possessed, since their first deployment, transformed idealistic warriors into efficient instruments of controlled violence. The study, filled with a silence more profound than Matthew had ever experienced before, sound invaded his world. 4 people, suspended in a moment where every possible future branched from decisions that would define whether redemption existed or if some betrayals carved canyons too wide for any bridge to span. Matthew's voice grew stronger, with each word he'd never spoken before, and he turned from his father to face Riker with an expression that contained wisdom no 10-year-old should possess, addressing the armed man who'd invaded their home. With a proposal that defied every tactical principle Marcus had ever taught or followed. "You want those codes so you can disappear, start over somewhere the Navy can't find you. But my father's name on those documents means you'll never be safe, because they'll hunt him forever, and eventually that hunt will circle back to you." Riker's jaw tightened as he processed the logic coming from a child who'd spent a decade reading adults-like texts written in body language and micro-expressions, his finger still resting near his weapon's trigger, but his posture shifting towards something that resembled attention rather than threat. Marcus felt his tactical mind racing through scenarios, calculating odds, understanding that Matthew was negotiating a suicide pact disguised as mercy, offering to architect his own father's destruction while simultaneously providing Riker an exit that might actually work. The study's grandfather clock continued its relentless counting, each tick marking the space between salvation and damnation, while the ocean outside crashed against rocks that had withstood centuries of erosion, yet eventually would become sand. "I'll give you the security codes for the estate perimeter. The alarm sequences my father thinks I don't know, but I learned by watching his fingers on the keypad every night for 3 years," Matthew continued, his hands supplementing, his uncertain voice with signs that carried their own eloquence, creating a bilingual confession that belonged simultaneously to the silent world he was leaving and the sonic one he was entering. "You walk out of here clean, disappear before the naval intelligence teams arrive, and in exchange you leave evidence that proves my father acted alone, that he made these deals without coercion or partnership." Admiral Carson rose from his chair with a strangled sound that wasn't quite protest or agreement, watching his son barter away his future with the same strategic brilliance that had made Carson himself a decorated naval officer before desperation transformed expertise into exploitation. Riker glanced at Marcus, seeking some indication from his former brother whether this child was seriously proposing to destroy his own father to save a traitor's life. And Marcus gave the smallest nod because he recognized in Matthew's eyes the same terrible calculus he'd performed 1,000 times in combat when every choice cost something. Irreplaceable. Matthew walked to his father's desk with steps that seemed to age him with each footfall, pulling open the drawer where Carson kept his personal tablet, his small fingers navigating security protocols while speaking directly to the Admiral with a gentleness that made the moment even more devastating. "You'll tell them everything. Dad, you'll confess, because living with what you did will hurt worse than any court-martial, and I need you to hurt the right way, to face what your love for me made you become." Carson reached for his son, but stopped himself, understanding that touch would be interpreted as manipulation rather than comfort, his face contorting with the recognition that Matthew's gift of hearing had granted him not the childhood joy Carson had imagined, but instead the burden of adult moral complexity compressed into an impossible decision. Riker holstered his weapon with a fluid motion that carried resignation rather than surrender, accepting the escape route Matthew offered while simultaneously acknowledging that this child had just outmaneuvered 2 decorated combat veterans and a naval intelligence officer through nothing more than brutal honesty and strategic compassion. Marcus moved to Matthew's side, not to interfere, but to bear witness. His presence a silent promise that whatever consequences this choice generated, the boy wouldn't face them alone. The study door opened to reveal the sound of approaching sirens that Marcus had called for 30 minutes earlier, their wailing growing louder as Riker moved toward the window, where a rope already hung toward the cliffs below, pausing only to meet Matthew's eyes with something that looked like respect mixed with sorrow before. Disappearing into the coastal darkness that had swallowed so many men who confused survival with purpose. The spring morning arrived with that particular quality of light that coastal Massachusetts reserves for those who've survived their darkest winters, and Marcus stood beside Matthew at the memorial he'd built on the cliff, overlooking the estate where their lives had collided 6 months earlier with the force of inevitability. The stone structure rose modest and simple against the endless sky, carved with his daughter's name alongside a quote about silence being its own language, and Matthew traced the letters with fingers that had learned to translate the world through touch. Before sound had complicated everything, Marcus watched his son because that's what the adoption papers declared, what his heart had claimed long before any legal signature, arrange fresh flowers around the base, his movements carrying the deliberate grace of someone who understood that gestures often spoke more truthfully than words. The ocean below performed its eternal percussion, waves striking stone in rhythms that Matthew could now hear, but still felt first through his feet, through his bones, through the body that would always remember its silent years as foundational rather than lacking. Marcus wore his old Navy uniform for the occasion, the ribbons and medals representing a life he'd once thought defined him before fatherhood revealed what actual courage required, his throat tight with emotions that refused convenient categorization. "She would have liked you," Marcus said quietly, knowing Matthew's device picked up every syllable, but also knowing the boy read his lips from habit, from the comfort of redundancy in communication. Matthew looked up with those eyes that had witnessed too much and somehow remained capable of hope, his hand reaching for the leather pouch that now hung empty around Marcus's neck, like a talisman commemorating transformation rather than loss. The wind carried salt and possibility, tugging at their clothes with insistence that suggested the dead don't demand stillness from the living, but rather motion, continuation, the audacity to build new families from the wreckage of old ones. Marcus felt Matthew's hand slip into his own, their fingers interlocking with the casual intimacy of people who'd negotiated trauma together and emerged not undamaged but undefeated, carrying scars that testified to survival rather than surrender. Matthew's mouth opened and closed twice before sound emerged, his voice still uncertain after months of speech therapy, but growing stronger with practice, with permission, with the understanding that he could choose silence or sound as tools rather than limitations. "Tell me about her," he said, his words slightly shaped wrong but perfectly understood, his free hand signing simultaneously in the beautiful bilingual dance he'd created for himself. Marcus knelt beside him so their eyes met at equal height, beginning the story he'd told 100 times, but never to someone who truly needed to inherit it. His daughter's memory becoming a bridge between past grief and present grace. "She loved the ocean like you do," Marcus began, his voice catching, then steadying, as Matthew leaned against his shoulder. Two people learning that family isn't discovered intact, but rather constructed deliberately from intention and witness, and the daily choice to show up for each other's healing. "Dad," Matthew said suddenly, the word emerging like a prayer or declaration, his first truly self-initiated speech, directed not at therapists or social workers, but at the man who'd taught him that protection sometimes meant letting go, and love sometimes demanded impossible choices. Marcus felt something break open in his chest, some calcified grief finally releasing its grip as tears blurred his vision of the memorial, of the ocean, of the boy who'd given him purpose when he'd forgotten men could be remade by the children they chose to raise, rather than only the ones they'd lost. They stood together as the morning expanded around them, Marcus's hand on Matthew's shoulder while the wind carried away words and silence equally, treating both as sacred, as the stone monument bore witness to endings that generated beginnings and losses that paradoxically created the emptiness necessary for new love to take root. The estate behind them stood empty now, sold to pay for Admiral Carson's legal defense, but neither looked back because forward held enough complexity and promise to occupy their attention, enough work and healing to fill the years ahead with meaning that didn't require words to justify itself. Could you make the same choice Matthew did, sacrificing one parent to save another's soul? Subscribe to witness more stories where love demands the impossible and hope emerges from devastating decisions.